Have you ever heard of one of the most horrific deaths recorded in the Bible? It wasn't by the sword, it wasn't in battle, it wasn't through betrayal. It was something much worse. A powerful king, dressed like a god, praised by the people, fell in the most humiliating and irreversible way possible. Herod Agrippa I, the man who persecuted Christians and tried to wipe out the early church, met a fate no one could have imagined. He was devoured by worms. Yes, you read that right. A king at the height of his pride, reduced to nothing in a matter of moments. But what caused such a bizarre and terrifying death? Was it just a disease, or was there something much bigger behind it? Herod's story is not just an ancient tale, it is a living lesson about what happens when someone challenges God's sovereignty. He was not the first to try and exalt himself above the Creator, and he certainly wasn't the last. Throughout history, many leaders have tried to place themselves above God, believing they could rule without consequences. But what happened to them? One by one, they fell. And the question remains, why does this pattern keep repeating? What causes powerful men to be destroyed at the height of their glory? But before you think this is just about an ancient king, pause and reflect. How many people today are chasing recognition, power, and influence without realizing they are walking the same path as Herod? Pride isn't just found in royal palaces. It can take root in the heart of anyone who believes they can live without God. And if there's one thing this story makes clear, it's that no one can challenge the Creator without facing the consequences. The most fascinating part? While Herod was exalting himself, something else was happening in the background. The church, which he tried to destroy, was growing. The Christianity he wanted to erase was only getting stronger, and at the very moment he thought he had reached the peak of his power, his ruin was sealed. And this wasn't just an ordinary fall, it was a divine warning that left everyone in shock. Because when God decides to act, no army, no wealth, no political influence can stop his judgment. So what really happened to Herod? How did his death become one of the most horrifying in the Bible? And more importantly, what does this story mean for you today? Stay with me, because what you are about to discover may completely change the way you see pride, power, and divine judgment. Before we continue, if you enjoy our videos and feel that they have blessed your life, please like and comment, even if it's just an amen. This makes a huge difference in helping this content reach more people and impact lives. If you're not yet subscribed, take this moment to subscribe and turn on notifications. Share this message with those you love and help spread faith. And hope every like, comment, and share strengthens this work that we do with great dedication to bless your life. Together, we can reach even more hearts. Now let's continue. Herod Agrippa I, a name that resonated with power and influence, was a master strategist in the political game. Grandson of Herod the Great and a close friend of Emperor Claudius, he ruled over Judea and Samaria with an iron grip, consolidating his leadership. In the unfolding scene of early Christianity, his presence became synonymous with control and oppression. But behind his apparent strength lay an invisible trap: arrogance. Herod didn't just want to rule, he craved recognition, reverence, and near-divine adoration. That insatiable thirst for greatness sowed the seeds of his own downfall, a prime example of how arrogance can turn power into destruction. To maintain his position, Herod knew he had to please the religious authorities of the time. Political alliances are built on shared interests, and the Jewish leaders wanted Christianity eradicated. Driven by the need for approval, Herod launched a fierce persecution against Christians, striking directly at the early church. He ordered the execution of James, the brother of John, and quickly noticed how this act earned him prestige among the Pharisees and Sadducees. It was a dangerous game. Each drop of Christian blood spilled made him feel more powerful. But here's the problem. Power gained through oppression is never lasting. The thirst for recognition knew no bounds, and Herod began to see himself as irreplaceable. This relentless pursuit of influence reminds us of many leaders throughout history who, blinded by arrogance, ultimately destroyed themselves. If we look at great empires, we notice a pattern. Whenever a ruler places themselves above morality and justice, their downfall is only a matter of time. Napoleon, Nero, Hitler all believed they could manipulate destiny, but history always demands its price. And for Herod, it would be no different. But absolute power is not just a personal vice. It blinds. Herod believed he could control every aspect of his life, but ignored the divine factor. And here's the detail many leaders fail to recognize. History has already proven that no earthly sovereignty can challenge God's supreme authority. He thought he was in charge, free to act however he pleased, without consequences. But while he plotted his domination plans, heaven had already signed his sentence. And this is precisely the moment we realize how human pride can become a deadly trap. Ironically, as Herod exalted himself, the early church continued to grow. He persecuted, tried to suffocate Christianity at its roots, but all he did was strengthen it. The very man who wanted to be remembered as a great king ended up as an example of failure. His story teaches us that power without purpose, influence, without humility, and leadership without service are recipes for disaster. If there's one thing we should learn, it's that the more someone seeks their own glory, the faster they walk toward their downfall. But if Herod thought controlling Christians was enough to secure his throne, he didn't account for an unexpected factor, the unshakable faith and prayers of the church. While he schemed his next move, a silent force was in motion, something he could never have anticipated. Herod Agrippa. I wasn't just a king. He was a tactician who knew how to win the favor of those with religious power. He realized that by persecuting Christians, he gained even more influence among Jewish leaders who saw the rise of the early church as a threat. So, he decided to act ruthlessly. He ordered the execution of James, John's brother, becoming the first ruler to eliminate an apostle. But as is the case with every leader driven by arrogance, he didn't realize that in trying to destroy Christianity, he was actually strengthening it. The blood of the martyrs was never the end of the church. On the contrary, it has always been the fuel for its growth. Not satisfied with James's death, Herod intensified his oppression by imprisoning Peter, one of the primary leaders of the church. His strategy was clear: eliminate key figures and destabilize Jesus' followers. The plan seemed flawless. He held political authority, military power ensured his orders were executed, and religious leaders endorsed his actions. But Herod underestimated one thing he couldn't control: the faith of the Christians. While he focused on decrees and imprisonment, the church was moving in prayer, crying out for divine intervention. The persecution wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Imagine being one of those Christians, seeing an apostle executed, another imprisoned, and knowing you could be next at any moment. Fear was real. Uncertainty clouded every secret gathering. Yet they didn't give up. This is a lesson that still echoes today. When faith is genuine, no threat can extinguish it. Throughout history, Christians have faced similar situations, from those thrown to the lions in the Roman Empire to those who, even today, suffer persecution worldwide. The setting changes, but the truth remains. True Christianity never retreats. In the face of oppression, what Herod didn't realize was that his actions were only accelerating something he feared most: the spreading of the gospel. The more he persecuted, the more Christians scattered, carrying Jesus' message to new territories. It was like trying to put out a fire by blowing on the embers. Instead of extinguishing it, he was spreading the flames. History is full of rulers who tried to suppress the truth by force, but all without exception failed. Rome tried, the Inquisition tried, totalitarian regimes tried, and yet God's word remains. It's interesting to note that Herod saw persecution as a means to strengthen his rule, but in reality, he was digging his own grave. Rulers who use fear as a weapon always become slaves to their own tactics. He could imprison, torture, execute, but he couldn't control the faith of those who had surrendered their lives to something greater. His arrogance blinded him to a simple reality: no one can fight against God and win. But while Herod thought he had everything under control, something was happening behind the scenes. In a dimly lit room, surrounded by uncertainty, a group of Christians gathered in silence and fervor. They had no armies, no political power, but they had something Herod would never understand: a faith that moved the impossible. And it was this faith that triggered one of the most astonishing miracles in history. While Herod Agrippa I strengthened his rule through persecution, the early church strengthened its faith through prayer. For many, Peter's imprisonment seemed like a fatal blow to the emerging Christian movement. If James had already been executed, what hope remained for their most prominent apostle? A human response to this situation would be despair, panic, surrender. But the Church of Christ didn't react the way the world expected. Instead of scattering in fear, the Christians united in fervent, unceasing prayer. Their prayer was not symbolic, not just a ritual. They knew they were crying out to the God who had already raised the dead, parted the seas, and brought down walls. And they knew he could do it again. The most astonishing thing is that their prayers were not filled with doubt, but with certainty that God could intervene. They didn't say, "if it's possible," nor did they murmur in resignation. They cried out with fervor, fully trusting that the impossible was in God's hands. This is a crucial point many ignore today. Praying is not just speaking to God. Praying with faith means believing he answers. How often do people offer empty prayers, expecting nothing? But these Christians prayed like someone knocking on a door, fully expecting it to open. And here lies the difference between a ritualistic prayer and a transformative one. This is a powerful lesson for any Christian facing difficulties. When everything seems lost, the solution is not in despair, but in intimacy with God. If you've ever gone through moments where there seemed to be no way out, then you understand the weight of this teaching. But the question is, how do you respond? Do you seek human solutions, or do you get on your knees? The early church had no resources, no political influence, but they had something no king could take away: a faith that translated into relentless prayer. And when a group of people unites to pray, heaven moves. Peter's imprisonment reminds us that sometimes answers come from the least expected places. The Christians could have attempted a rescue, sought political alliances for his release, but instead they chose to trust. The world operates through strategies and plans, but God works through faith. And it was this faith that triggered an unprecedented miracle. It wasn't luck, it wasn't coincidence. It was a manifestation of divine power in response to a church that refused to stop praying. The most fascinating part? They prayed without even knowing what was happening inside the prison. To them, it didn't matter whether they saw the answer immediately. They simply trusted. This teaches us that prayer is not about demanding immediate evidence, but believing that God moves at the right time. How many times do answers come in ways we never imagined? And that is exactly what happened to Peter. While the church prayed, the impossible was already unfolding. And then something incredible happened. Inside the prison, surrounded by chains and guards, Peter was sleeping. He wasn't desperate. He wasn't anxious. But what he didn't know was that very night, his life was about to take an unexpected turn. Peter was in prison, chained between two soldiers, surrounded by guards watching his every move. To human eyes, escape was impossible. Security was tight. Execution seemed imminent, and for anyone else, this would have been their last night alive. Yet Peter, astonishingly, was sleeping. How does someone sleep on the eve of death? Only someone who fully trusts in God's power. While Herod delighted in his own authority and the guards fulfilled their duty, heaven had already decided that no man could thwart divine plans. And then the impossible happened. An angel of the Lord appeared inside the prison, illuminating everything around him. The scene was almost unbelievable. The angel touched Peter and woke him up, saying, "Get up quickly." And at that exact moment, the chains fell from his hands. No struggle, no resistance, no logical explanation. God didn't need a rebellion, didn't need bribes, didn't need political negotiations. He simply acted. And this teaches us something profound. When God decides to set someone free, nothing can stop it. No closed door, no chain, no human authority stands against divine power. How many times do people find themselves trapped in hopeless situations, believing all is lost, when in reality, God already has a solution prepared? What's even more interesting is that Peter, still groggy, thought he was dreaming. The human mind struggles to comprehend the supernatural. Even when God acts, people sometimes have difficulty believing. How often does someone receive a blessing and say, "This is too good to be true"? But God doesn't operate within human logic. He operates through purpose. The angel led Peter out of the prison, past the guards, unnoticed. The gates opened on their own, as if commanded by an invisible force. Herod had done everything to ensure Peter wouldn't escape, but he had overlooked one detail. He was fighting against the God of the impossible. When Peter finally realized it was real and not a vision, a shock of reality hit him. God had not only freed him from prison, but also saved him from Herod's death sentence. The irony is that Herod had planned this execution to impress Jewish leaders, but the one who ended up humiliated was himself. Christianity would not be silenced. Peter didn't just survive, he became a living testimony that no earthly power can prevail against God's will. This story proves that when we trust and pray, miracles happen, even when we don't know how. Imagine how Herod reacted when he heard what had happened. His guards, his schemes, his strategies, everything collapsed in a single night. When God moves, he not only answers prayers, but exposes the futility of human arrogance. Peter, who was supposed to be dead by morning, was free. The church, which was supposed to be terrified, was stronger than ever. What was meant to be a blow against Christianity became a testimony of its power. And yet, this wasn't the end. Herod, enraged and humiliated, saw his authority being questioned. But instead of humbling himself, his heart grew even more hardened with pride. And it was this arrogance that would lead him to a fate no one could have predicted. Herod's humiliation after Peter's miraculous escape was no small thing. His carefully orchestrated plan to display strength before the Jewish leaders had completely failed, and his once feared reputation was now tarnished by ridicule. Like any ruler consumed by arrogance, he did not handle this setback well. Instead of reflecting on what had happened, he hardened his heart even more. Herod refused to acknowledge that there was a power greater than his own. And as is the case with many who let vanity take over, his response was to double down on his self-exaltation. The king then traveled to Caesarea, where he found a crowd, eager to praise him as a divine figure. It was everything he needed to feed his ego. The occasion was a grand public ceremony, attended by political leaders and citizens hoping to impress the monarch. Herod dressed in a dazzling silver robe that reflected the sunlight, making him appear almost celestial. It was a carefully planned spectacle, designed to leave an impact. As he began to speak, the people, mesmerized by his appearance and powerful voice, started shouting, "This is the voice of a god, not of a man." It was the pinnacle of his earthly glory, the moment when he could have acknowledged that all power comes from God. But instead, he embraced the adoration, absorbing every word as if he truly deserved it. Here lies a crucial lesson about the nature of pride. Herod could have used that moment to acknowledge that all human power is temporary, but instead he chose to believe he was untouchable. This is no different from what we have seen throughout history. How many powerful men, at the peak of their success, believed they were invincible? How many, blinded by their own vanity, lost all sense of reality? Pride is deceptive because it makes us forget that everything we have can disappear in an instant. And that is exactly what happened to Herod. If he thought he could place himself above God without consequences, he was about to learn the hard way that no man can challenge the Creator without facing judgment. While he basked in the people's praise, something unseen but terrifyingly real had already begun inside him. At that very moment, God decreed his judgment. It was the end of a ruler who had dared to challenge divine sovereignty. What happened next was something no one could have expected. The king, who moments earlier had been gloriously shining before the crowd, suddenly began to wither away. The scene that unfolded was shocking. The man who had just been exalted as a god now writhed in pain. It was not just discomfort, not a fainting spell. It was something far worse. Herod had ignored every warning, had elevated himself to a level few dared, and now he faced the inevitable consequences of his arrogance. The same crowd that had just praised him now watched in horror as their so-called god collapsed before them. Herod's arrogance had reached its peak, but his fall was even faster. And if people thought his death would be ordinary, they were about to witness one of the most horrifying ends recorded in history. The glow of pride had barely faded from Herod's eyes when divine judgment struck. In the middle of the crowd's adoration, as he reveled in his supposed divinity, an angel of the Lord struck him down. The impact was immediate. The man who just moments before was clothed in royal splendor and receiving godlike praise suddenly found himself writhing in unbearable agony. This wasn't just an illness. It wasn't a sudden weakness. This was divine judgment, public, undeniable, and terrifying. The very people who had worshipped him now stood in silence, watching in horror. The power Herod had so desperately sought, the influence he had worked so hard to maintain, all crumbled in an instant. What happened next was even more gruesome. Herod wasn't just struck with sickness, he was consumed by worms. Not days later, not weeks later, but at that very moment. The judgment was swift, painful, and humiliating. It was as if God himself was sending a clear message. No one steals his glory without facing the consequences. History is filled with rulers, emperors, and kings who attempted to elevate themselves to divine status, and all of them, without exception, met tragic ends. Babylon had Nebuchadnezzar, Rome had Nero, and now Judea had Herod Agrippa I. Herod's death is a stark reminder that God's judgment is inescapable. There was no war, no rebellion, no political coup. His downfall came directly from heaven. God didn't need an army, didn't need a rival king to overthrow him. He simply sent an angel. This teaches us that divine sovereignty does not rely on human means. A man may believe himself invincible, but a single word from God can erase decades of power in mere moments. True power never belonged to Herod, nor to any ruler in history. It has always belonged to God. The irony is striking. Herod had persecuted Christians, trying to eradicate the early church, but in the end, he was the one who was eradicated. His schemes backfired, and as his body decayed before everyone's eyes, the church he sought to destroy continued to grow. This teaches us a crucial lesson. No one can fight against God and win. Persecution may be intense, oppression may be severe, but truth always prevails. What happened to Herod was not an accident, not a natural disease. It was direct judgment from the Almighty. News of his death spread rapidly, and with it a powerful message. God is just, and those who exalt themselves will be humbled. This event strengthened the early church even further, proving that no ruler can stand against God's will. But this story doesn't end here. If Herod's death was a turning point, what happened next would prove even more definitively that Christianity does not merely survive persecution, it thrives because of it. Because while an arrogant king fell, the kingdom of God kept advancing. Herod Agrippa. His death was not just the end of an arrogant ruler. It was a pivotal moment that strengthened the faith of Christians and displayed God's undeniable power. For years, he had ruthlessly persecuted the early church, believing he could crush it with force and intimidation. But what happened? Instead of weakening, Christianity emerged stronger than ever. Every attempt to silence it only fueled its expansion, and Herod's horrifying death became an unforgettable warning that no ruler can challenge God's sovereignty without suffering the consequences. The church was not alone. God himself fought for it. Christians, once afraid of persecution, now had an unshakable confidence in God's justice. If Herod, with all his political and military power, fell so humiliatingly, that meant no enemy of the faith was truly untouchable. This paradox has always marked the church's history. The more the world tries to crush it, the more it grows. Rome burned Christians, threw them to lions, outlawed their message, yet the gospel spread across the world. Christianity does not endure through human strength, but because it carries an eternal truth. The death of Herod sent shockwaves through the land, and even Christianity's enemies began to fear. If a ruler as powerful as Herod had been struck down, who could feel safe opposing the God of the Christians? Without lifting a single sword, the church gained a victory over its oppressors. The real war was never political, it was spiritual. But this story isn't just about the past. What happened to Herod remains a warning today. The question is not whether God will judge the proud. The question is only when. The story of Herod Agrippa I is not just an account of a fallen king. It is a powerful lesson about the dangers of arrogance and the certainty of divine judgment. The Bible makes it clear, God resists the proud but gives grace to the humble. James 4:6. Herod chose to exalt himself. He allowed himself to be worshipped as a god, and his destruction came swiftly and terribly. This teaches us that anyone who lifts themselves up will be brought low. All glory belongs to God alone, and those who attempt to take it for themselves will face consequences. No position of power, no political influence, and no amount of wealth can save someone from God's judgment. This principle doesn't apply only to kings and rulers. How many people today live seeking recognition, trying to be greater than they really are? How often does pride blind people into thinking they are self-sufficient, that their success is purely the result of their own effort? Herod was an extreme case, but his story is a warning to all of us. Humans have a dangerous tendency to believe they don't need God, that they can control their own destinies. But it takes only one divine decree to change everything. True security is not found in human power, but in humility before the Creator. Herod's downfall also teaches us about the danger of seeking human approval. He lived to impress others, to be exalted, to hold on to his position at any cost. Yet when his judgment came, there was no crowd that could save him. This is a warning to those who build their identity on the opinions of others, who live for the praise of people. The pursuit of personal glory is a trap that leads to destruction. True success is not about being exalted by men, but about being approved by God. On the other hand, this story reinforces the importance of faith in those who remain firm. While Herod exalted himself, the church prayed. While he trusted in his power, the Christians trusted in God, and in the end, who prevailed? The church continued to grow, while Herod's name became a symbol of spiritual failure. This proves that no matter how strong the opposition seems, those who remain faithful to the Lord will always have the final victory. It may not happen immediately, it may come in unexpected ways, but it will come. And here is the real question. What does this story mean for you? Are there areas in your life where pride has taken hold? Have you been living for personal recognition rather than for God's purpose? Or have you been like the early church, standing firm in faith no matter the circumstances? This is the moment to reflect, because the truth is undeniable. Those who exalt themselves will be humbled, but those who trust in the Lord will never be put to shame. Because in the end, it is not the powerful of this world who decide the fate of humanity, it is God. And Herod's story is the ultimate proof of that. Now tell me, what does this story mean for you? Have you, in any way, been seeking recognition, power, or human approval instead of God's will? Pride isn't just a problem for kings. It can appear in everyday choices, in small attitudes that reveal a heart that has drifted away from dependence on God. The Bible teaches that those who exalt themselves will be humbled, but those who humble themselves before the Lord will be lifted up in due time. And the real question is, are you willing to recognize this before it's too late? The story of Herod Agrippa I proves that no one can challenge God without facing consequences. Maybe today you feel persecuted, oppressed, or like nothing is working out for you. But remember what happened to the early church. While Herod tried to destroy them, they kept growing. While he sought to silence Christianity, the message spread even further. And when he thought he had full control, his power crumbled before the people. Do you trust that God is still in control, even when your circumstances say otherwise? And more than that, what will you do with this knowledge? Will you just hear it and forget it, or will you apply it to your life? Will you keep living as if you control your own destiny, or will you surrender to the true King? The difference between glory and ruin lies in your response to this question. Because God never changes, and His truth remains. Those who humble themselves before Him receive grace, but those who steal His glory will face judgment. Now I want to hear from you. What impacted you most about this story? Did you already know this part of the Bible? Comment below and let me know your thoughts. And don't forget, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share this video so that more people can learn this truth. See you in the next video.